Good afternoon. I'd like to provide an initial response to a series of proposals which the Labor Party had today released and which they claim will enhance the enabling legislation which is designed to give effect to the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. The government will, in good faith, consider these proposals and we will respond accordingly. For some time now, we've been saying that if the opposition put forward any proposals of substance, that we would look at them. Until today, all we've heard are a series of sound bites and accusations for months and months, and nothing specific, absolutely nothing of substance has come forward from the Labor Party over those months of rhetoric and abuse, especially by the unions, and the misrepresentations that we've heard now for some time. We do welcome Labor's belated acceptance that in no way can the agreement with China be opened up, that the opposition basically is looking for added comfort for provisions that in fact already exist within the agreement. Could I just also say, as I have repeatedly sought to make clear, the principal criteria by which we will judge and measure these proposals are firstly that we won't entertain anything which discriminates against China. If embodied in these exposure draft so-called proposals, if there are measures which would lead to a discrimination against China, that will rule out any consideration of that proposal. Secondly, if anything contravenes the firm commitments that we've made in this free trade agreement, again, we won't be considering such measures. It does appear that Labor's number one objective, in fact, as Bill Shorten described it, is to seek clarity and comfort around existing safeguards for Australian workers associated with the agreement within the free trade agreement called the Investment Facilitation Arrangement, which goes to projects over 150 million and where needed, if there is a shortage of skilled workers, that they could seek to bring them in and bring them in quickly. Now, these safeguards, which see labour market testing as a mandatory requirement for all occupations sought under these infrastructure facilitation or investment facilitation agreements, they are indeed already clear government policy. The safeguards that Penny Wong and Bill Shorten talked about are in fact already clear government policy and are embedded in the requirements by the Department of Immigration, the guidelines that apply for this provision. When they go to enact, if this thing comes into force, when the Department of Immigration seeks to facilitate the operation of these measures, the guidelines that they are required to follow, that are embedded in the Immigration Department's own policy documents, the government's policy documents, are already clear government policy, and they are totally consistent with the provisions that were there under Labor. In fact, the Labor government itself, the recent Labor government, introduced many of these provisions, and certainly the worker protections under the so-called IFA or Investment Facilitation Agreements are exactly identical to those that existed under a similar provision within the Labor Party brought in for Gina Ridehart's operation and others. And in fact, we've enhanced it. We've enhanced those provisions under that migration, under the enterprise migration agreements with Labor. They required a labour market assessment. Under our IFAs, the Investment Facilitation Agreement, we require labour market analysis, as Labor did, but we also require labour market testing. That was not a condition of enterprise agreements. The government's number one priority at this stage is to do everything we can, reasonably can, to ensure that the China Free Trade Agreement can be brought into force before the end of this year, so the benefits can flow quickly to our exporters and to our consumers and to our importers for that matter, because many of our importers will have cheaper inputs into their own manufacturing processes or whatever. Entry into force this year will see an immediate round of tariff cuts that will be followed in January 1st with a second round of tariff cuts. So if we can finish this deal and have it into place, have it legislated and exchange letters with China before the end of the year, then we will see the first round of tariff cuts, which are worth about 600 million, 300 million to agriculture alone. If we don't get it in this year, if it's pushed into next year, we lose that benefit. We lose that benefit because we will have pushed back for a whole year the start of these benefits. Labor, I think, needs to consider this through the prism of national interest and not the narrow self-interest of the militant trade unions, CFMEU and the ETU. For decades, we have enjoyed a high level of bipartisan support for freer trade. And because sensible and level heads on both sides of the parliament have agreed that freer trade is in the interest of jobs and growth and a lot of our quality of life compared with the rest of the world has derived from the freer trade that we have, and that's had bipartisan support. And I do feel that ultimately, in regard to this agreement with our biggest trading partner, bear in mind, we are hopeful that this tradition will continue. Finally, could I make one final point before I open it up for a couple of questions? We don't, having received something of some substance from the Labor Party, there's a fair bit of detail in it, we don't intend to hold these discussions in public. Peter Dutton and I, Peter Dutton, our Immigration Minister of course, and myself, will study these proposals. Then we'll have genuine discussions with the Labor Party, and hopefully it will identify a pathway to get this thing through the Parliament. We simply can't, we've got to move quickly and we've got to get it in place and get this behind us. We can't go to the wire and take the chance that this will go through. We can't take anything for granted. There are significant anti-trade people within the opposition, and if we allow this to go to the wire, one, it's going to continue to confuse our trading partner with the nature of the debate here, but more importantly, it could lead to silly things happening at the end.
Minister, Mr. Robb, given you've had informal discussions with Senator Wong and what you've seen today, is there anything prima facie that you see you have a problem with that affects the substance of the agreement, the text, and how quickly do you want to get around the table for the formal talks with Senator Wong?
Well, the second part first, the sooner the better, sooner the better. As soon as we've been able to get our head around it and see whether it meets those principles that I established, and then see if it's workable, and is it in many cases it does seem to be duplicating existing requirements, but we'll talk through all of that. This is the first time an hour ago that I saw this document. We have had informal discussions and to test the appetite for getting together. We established that. As I say, I think the Labor Party has been saying now for 2 or 3 or more weeks that this deal is a good deal and it should be supported. So there is that appetite and preparedness. So we want to act in good faith in that regard. But I haven't had a chance to study it to the point of answering your question. I'll get all my experts to tell me that. Sometimes in legislation, one thing I have learned is one word can make a hell of a difference. So I don't want to presume that.
Increasing the base rate of 457 visa holders, the government's frozen it. Labor wants to reinstate indexation of it. What's your thought in principle? Would that potentially jeopardise and push up the cost of projects in which people want to invest?
Well, again, I need to have a look at it. I'll just make 2 points. One, I did see that that they accepted that there needed to be ministerial discretion in regard to certain areas like abattoirs and the tourism sector, etc. Right? But the second point I'd make is that there was an extensive independent review taken of these provisions, and at the end of it, changes, improvements were made. I think with support from both sides of the parliament, but at that stage the rate was frozen, pending a 2-year review, independent review, which is somewhat underway now, right? So we'll see how that measures up against whatever it is they've put in this series of proposals.
Mr. Robb, if you make any changes along the lines that Labor are seeking, will that be an acknowledgement that there were some problems in the ChAFTA deal in its original form?
No, not in my view. I mean, what they have...
Why not?
Well, because, firstly, they have accepted that in no way can the substance or the document, the agreement, be opened up in any sense, including the MOU and including the side letters, right? So what has been agreed will be, if this enters into force with some or of the provisions that they're talking about, or without, nothing will change. Secondly, at first glance, the things that they are asking for either provide clarity or they provide comfort, greater comfort to existing measures.
So, Minister, in relation to labour market testing, given that it's government policy on these IFAs to have it anyway, would there be any obstacle to putting that in legislation?
Well, that's what we've got to look at. I mean, that goes to, I think, their principal concern, frankly.
But you're happy to do that?
Well, we've got to look at how we do that, what's it mean, what act is it in, obviously probably the Migration Act, what implications, how does it undermine flexibility, what other commitments we made to other countries at other times. All of these things, as if this has to apply not just to China, but to the application of, in the case of that issue, these major projects, over 150 million, that opportunity is there for every country, right? And every company in every country. So we have to look at beyond China. We have to make sure that this doesn't discriminate against China, that it's a one-off provision just for China. That will undermine the integrity of the document, and it will be a breach of good faith with the Chinese, who I think are very proud of this agreement. They made a lot of concessions to Australia in this agreement. They're looking to Australia to help them transform their economy into a service-based economy where the jobs are. Now, all of these things are captured within this free trade agreement, and we are not going to in any way interfere with the integrity of this document.
Minister, there was, just on a separate agreement, there was a release out of Peru of the TPP's IP chapter. Have you seen that? Is that an accurate reflection of what you've agreed upon? And there's been criticism by experts in that field that a lot has been surrendered to American intellectual property law. What would you say to that criticism?
Well, no, one, I haven't seen the document. Secondly, the strongest anti-reaction of all the countries, as I understand, is within the United States, and it's led by the pharmaceutical companies. Senator Hatch, was damning, woefully inadequate was his description. He's led the charge on the pharmaceuticals. All I can say to you is that what the agreement does, and it's very clear in the text, is allow two streams of approach to providing IP protection for pharmaceuticals. One stream is the American approach, and it says, or alternatively, countries can follow the second stream, which is basically our system. It is 5 years of data protection. It is a robust patent system, which the US haven't got, and it's other measures that some countries have got, measures that we've got, the 1.5 years of approvals, for instance, to get the biosimilar into place. All of these things, they all combine to provide what we think is the right balance of protection of IP without putting upward pressure on prices. And the week after this TPP enters into force, if it gets the approval of all the countries, our health system will have changed in no way compared with the week before this enters into force.
On that exclusivity, Mr. Robb, are there some really complex molecules where it goes to 8 years rather than the 5?
No, there's absolutely no. 5 years is, as I said, there is absolutely no change for Australia. Absolutely no change. Instead of everyone thought that there's going to be, the Americans are here and we're here, we'll have to find somewhere in the middle, right? So that's driven everyone to think we must give up some data protection. We must increase some data protection, right? But it's not. They're there with a data protection program. Basically, that's all it is. It's all data protection driven. The US got 12 years, right? But we're there with 5.5 years, but in combination with a patent system which works. And we're not going to change it. We are not going to change anything because our system works. It delivers an equivalent amount of market protection to the companies that are producing these drugs as the alternative approach of the Americans. Our first question will be fairly, it'll be a bit embarrassing. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Launched today. I was with Professor Harper in Melbourne last week where we happened to be talking about competition policy at some length, and we discussed this, and I was very happy to be able to come along here, and I'm particularly pleased that Jane Briggs is here with me today.